Hello and welcome to section 3 of the data-driven testing in Selenium video course. Previously, we've created basis for the testing framework, so now we should start exercising data-driven approach in full. So now it's time to play around data-driven testing implementation directly. In this section, I'll describe basic ideas of the data-driven approach and basic recommendations. Then, we'll start practicing it by adding parameters to our tests and playing with different constructions. In the end, we'll exercise several typical data sources like services, files and databases. And we'll start with the first video. In this video, we will talk about data-driven approach, what it is and where it is applicable. We'll define basic principle of it. Also, we'll go through several basic recommendations which can be in use while practicing data-driven. In the first sections, we'll briefly mention that approach. It comes naturally after you notice that a lot of our tests are nearly identical except the data they operate. So, it may become convenient to keep data source separate of test logic and tests just define operations for test. So, the approach is about exercising the same flow on different data and separate test data from the test itself. Technically, it looks like we create common function and call it with various parameter sets. Typically, data-driven approach is well applicable for search functionality, booking with different payment types, same flow negative cases with error messages verification, and many others. Major criterion is the same sequence of actions to be performed over the set of non-equivalent data. What benefits can we take from it? Firstly, we put repetitive set of tests under common structure. Thus, we minimize code duplication. Secondly, having the compact data source, we can easily expand the test coverage by adding just another data row into the data source. And finally, we simply separate data and actual code. Thus, we can provide convenient format for data input to analyze coverage and missing cases. Before we go to the practical implementation, it is worth to mention several recommendations which are nice to follow while using data-driven approach. They are not mandatory, but they are nice to follow. Again, these are just recommendations. Major recommendation is that we should not try to apply this approach every test we ever can find. Some people may create test which initially has a data source assigned and it has just single data row. If you decide to reserve some structure for further expansion, just add at least 2 rows for data. Otherwise, it's possible that in the future you'll forget about this reservation and, at the same time, test will have extra dependency and it may not be that nicely readable. Just think that every approach has areas where it is not that good. Another recommendation is that you shouldn't confuse test data and configuration options. There are some items which are global to the entire environment, like predefined user accounts, which are global for entire set of tests. It is really not needed to keep them all as a part of the data for dedicated set of tests. Next recommendation is to keep test flow with minimal complexity. A lot of tests may have the same sequence, but in some parameters the flow may require some conditions to handle. This way, after some time, the common scenario may become unreadable mess of various if statements. Such thing can be mitigated by having several flows running on dedicated data, or the conditional processing logic can be hidden and distributed between underlying methods. But the main flow should have minimal complexity, at least as much as possible. That was basic introduction to the data-driven approach. But that was just theory, and it's time to switch into practice.